Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to a video in which I'm basically just doing some random thought connection, free association. I don't pretend that any of this is particularly profound, but it's just kind of like a path my thinking took in recent weeks, and I don't know, I thought I would share it because a lot of it has to do with books. As you know, I was trained in history, write nonfiction, write history, and so that's kind of one of my primary areas of interest. And that blends together for me a lot with talking about literature and reading a lot of fiction. Well, being Jane Austen July, I picked up a Jane Austen biography to read, and that was Jane Austen Life by Claire Tomalin. Now, Tomalin is an acknowledged biographer of, as far as I know, highest integrity, and who does a great job with her subjects. I've been struggling with this because I found it to be dry and to be, most of the book not to be about Jane Austen. And, there's a really good reason for that. There's very little record of Jane Austen's life. The letters she wrote to her relatives mostly were burned or destroyed. There are other people's recollections of her, but, there isn't a lot of historical record to go on. And as a result, there are lots of mysteries associated with Jane Austen's life, like, why did she never marry? Why did she accept a marriage proposal and then turn it down? Was her heart broken by an earlier love she couldn't get over? And then also, I think kind of really, to me, the more interesting mystery is, why did she stop writing for about 10 years in the middle of her life? She wrote 3 of her books, Sense and Sensibility, Northanger Abbey, I believe, and Pride and Prejudice. She wrote 3 of her books as a relatively young woman in her 20s, and then didn't really start writing again for 10 years. Well, Tomalin doesn't really addresses all these kind of issues and doesn't come up with any definitive solution to any of them, except perhaps trying to explain why Jane Austen stopped writing for 10 years. And her explanation was that her family left their, traditional family home. They moved to Bath, and this was upsetting to Jane because it brought back kind of traumatic childhood memories that she had of being sent off away from home and away from her mother and family when she was a young child to be raised essentially by others, and that this triggered depression. Now, Tomalin and you and I have no way of knowing if that's true. Tomalin kind of asserts it as though it is true. We are to accept that she's done the research and this is the conclusion she's come to, and that we at least have to take that conclusion seriously. And to be honest with you, that's how history works. Because the simple truth of the matter is that we never can't really accurately describe the reality of the past, even if someone wrote stuff down or kept a complete diary like the Diary of Samuel Pepys. Even if that was true, we have to take it with a grain of salt, because the person doing the writing, the person recording, the person maintaining those documents, those records, they have a point of view, they have a bias, they have their own standards by which they're judging everything that happens around them. And therefore, we can never really have this kind of firm grip, I think, on reality that we want. And even though I oftentimes argue things from a historical perspective, I'm aware that my historical perspective is based on, what I've learned, what I believe, my own biases. And so this kind of, I think, connects to the issue that's been talked about here, I think, many times on BookTube, and that's the issue of objectivity. Is objectivity possible? Well, I would argue that objectivity is possible, and have argued, in so much as people can create a set of standards that they apply objectively. The problem is that set of standards is different from every person. And to a certain extent, what we're talking about here is the thing in science that would be called the objectivity, what is it called? The objectivity effect. Thank you. It's called the, thank you to my notes. It's called the objectivity effect, the act of observing biases or affects the outcome of an experiment. And to a certain extent, history works that way. So, I don't know anything about Claire Tomalin. This whole childhood trauma thing is something that she thought of as being really important, as something she saw as being really significant, so, which to me indicates that she believes that things that take place in childhood have a profound effect on a person later in life. And maybe they do, and maybe we all accept that. But there's no doubt that, that is a belief she has that affects the way she looks at the historical material she gets. So that means that to a certain extent we all are biased, and I found this to be true in teaching history. And one of my favorite things about teaching history that I really liked was trying to kind of get people to question the myths they've been taught. This is one reason why last year or 2 years ago, Alexis Coe's biography of George Washington, You Never Forget Your First, a biography of George Washington, was so why I liked it so much, because it essentially attempts to, get rid of some of those myths that we have about George Washington, myths that even professional historian biographers have not necessarily been able to free themselves of. And I really think that's important. So, I have biases built in. There are things that were taught to me, repeated to me, over and over again as an American that lead me to have a pro-American bias. And to be honest with you, I have to remember to question the Founding Fathers. I have to remember to say to myself, well, there's another side to this. There's something that's true. I have to actively do that because the bias built into my system. And so what I find myself doing is trying to create a new set of standards over and over again. And I really think that's a new set of standards for me by which I judge historical events and historical personages in which I write about history that try to free myself of those biases which were ingrained. To give you some idea of how powerful the mythology of American history can be, I taught American history to college students all the time. And one of the things I emphasized during the period when teaching the history of colonization of the United States, or of the Americas by the English colonists, was to kind of destroy this myth that the American colonies were founded for religious freedom. That is and isn't true. Jamestown was not founded for religious freedom. The Plymouth colony, only half of the people on the Mayflower were actually, religious pilgrims, and they weren't necessarily seeking religious freedom. They just don't want their kids to grow up in the Netherlands and be exposed to that society. And when they wanted to create their own. Now, certainly in 1630, when the Massachusetts Bay Colony is founded, that was founded for religious purposes or religious ideals. Maryland was founded to be a colony for Catholics. Pennsylvania, a colony for Quakers. There were colonies founded for religious reasons, but whatever religious idea that had led to the founding of the colony was quickly subsumed by economic interests. And really, one way of looking, I think, at the colonization of the Americas by the English is that our religion was capitalism and making money and acquiring land and wealth. And that's what brought people to the colonies more than religious freedom. Not that religion didn't continue to play a real factor in the lives of lots of Americans. Certainly that's true. But eventually, colonies like Massachusetts, which absorbed Plymouth, colonies like Pennsylvania became more like colonies like Virginia and New York, which existed for essentially purely economic purposes. And that myth is one that we hold to be really important in the United States, that we were founded for religious freedom. This is why the far right talks about the United States being founded on Christian principles, which it most certainly was not. It was founded on Enlightenment principles. But that is an example of bias that we as Americans have to overcome. I think a lot of that bias explains why Americans assume that the United States is this kind of big do-gooding country that never does anything wrong, and explains a lot of our attitudes. Sorry, I've gone kind of far afield from what I want to talk about. But anyway, that we have these biases that kind of affect the way that we look at history, that affect the way that we look at historical personages, they affect the way that we write history, that we talk about history, that we approach history, that we use history in our politics. And this, I think, explains why, critical race theory has become such an easy manufactured bugaboo issue for the far right to use as a political weapon against the Democratic Party and against the left, because critical race theory views American history from the point of view of the impact that racism has had past, present, future on African Americans. CRT historians are just telling the true history of the colonization of the United States, in which African Americans were exploited, killed, murdered, worked to death, subjected to chattel slavery for the benefit of white people in the United States of America. Those very white people that we esteem, are taught to esteem as the founding fathers of the United States, brutally exploited other people, and that the economy of the United States was really dependent on enslaved African American labor, and that moving forward through history, those in power, white men, have found ways to use the power of government to prevent African Americans from advancing, from getting education, etc. That's what CRT argues. I don't know if any historian would argue that in principle that's not true. What they differ is how important that is. is the slave labor really the thing that made the United States economically powerful and led to economic growth, or was it the ingenuity of, pioneers and the founding fathers, etc.? Which one of those two things played a more important role? But what we're talking about here then is perspective. What we're talking about here is not a lack of objectivity. We're talking about a different set of standards. Now, I think that one set of standards looks at reality in a more direct way than another, that another kind of engages in this mythology, which is the opposite of reality that we built up around the founding fathers and George Washington. So, I kind of embrace that CRT version or view of American history. But saying that it looking at it from a particular point of view doesn't make it less real, doesn't make it less real than looking at it from a traditional point of view. They're just two different lenses that we're looking at it through. Okay, one of the things I think that we have to do as history is we have to try to come closer and closer to reality of what American history was and what history was in the past by adding as many points of view as possible until we get down to reality. And I think part of the reaction in conservative states like mine, Texas, against CRT is really just an effort to deny reality because that reality makes conservative white voters uncomfortable. But bringing up CRT then also then kind of brings me back to thinking about, or brought me back to thinking about books and what the right likes to call wokeness. Wokeness is this belief that right wing and other people have that essentially all decisions are made by, or what people on the left want is all decisions to be made based on just this promoting this idea of inclusion, and to hell with quality and to hell with reality. Let's just have as much inclusion as possible. That inclusion in and of itself is a virtue. Now, I don't want to get into whether or not inclusion is in and of itself a virtue. I happen to believe that it is, but this use of the term wokeness is again kind of a scare tactic word that's used to suggest to primarily white people that traditional standards and values are under attack by people on the left. And those people on the left are determined to force through their way of thinking. And they may be. But this kind of wokeness then, and thinking about CRT and wokeness, brought me to thinking about the Booker Prize. The Booker Prize long list was announced yesterday, day before yesterday. And I haven't really checked on the diversity of that list, but I'm guessing it's a fairly diverse list of authors with a blend of men and women, of people who would be LGBTQ plus people and straight people. I don't know if there are any trans people whose works made the list, old, young, different races, all those things. And so sooner or later, somebody's going to accuse the Booker Prize of being too woke. And this really then brought me back to this whole idea of perspective and how we view things. So, me, as a 55-year-old man, the standards I use and by which I judge literature and books are standards that were taught to me in the past. And those standards are largely based on the elevation of primarily white men as the greatest writers and the creators of the greatest fiction in the world. And so those are the standards that I have. And I think older generation Americans are likely to fall into that same kind of idea because, and people in general, because not just Americans, people in general, because of what we've been taught and the examples we've been given. And now what we see is that publishing is more diverse, and that judge prizes are more diverse. And we shouldn't then be surprised as we get more diverse judges and more diversity in publishing and more diverse readers, that the books that are awarded, the books that are published, the books that win award come from a more diverse set of authors. In the past, majority of readers were white men, and the authors they read were white men, and the works of fiction they elevated to greatness were those of white men, and the standards by which then we judge literature were the standards around those great works which were created by white men. And still today, white men still dominate a lot of the positions of power in publishing, etc. But as it's gotten more diverse, we have a group of people who are interested in stories told by other people than white men, and their standards about what makes good writing or good literature are different. And as long as they're applying those standards objectively, then they are being objective. Their standards are just different than the standards of the people in the past. That doesn't make them wrong, that makes them different. That doesn't make them woke, that makes them different. That doesn't make them an attack on traditional values that makes them a representation of changing values. And among those changing values, diversity. And among those changing values is the idea of hearing stories from a more diverse group of people, rather than just hearing stories from the group of people who dominated literature and writing for so long. So, the last thing in the world that's woke are these prize lists, because these prize lists that are more diverse are created by a more diverse group of judges who are applying a more diverse and a different set of standards of excellence than people did in the past. It's not surprising that white men used to dominate publication, and white men's books got published more than anybody else's, and white men won, and straight white men, I should add, won literary prizes because the judges were straight white men applying standards that were established as great literature and the standards by which you judge literature that were based on the works of straight white men. It shouldn't surprise us that as we have fewer straight white men in publishing, as more women take lead roles in publishing, as more diverse people, LGBTQ plus people, trans people, people of all races take on positions in publishing, that the books that get published are more diverse and the prize winners are a more diverse group. That's not intentional wokeness. That's a byproduct of the changing in the gatekeepers and the changing of standards, which happens all the time. This is nothing to fear. It's nothing to attack from my point of view. It's nothing to view as being a bad thing from my point of view. It's just different. It's different than what I grew up with. It's different than what a lot of people grew up with. It's a different set of standards by which we're judging literature. That doesn't make it a wrong set of standards. It just makes it different than yours. Anyway, there you go. That's my train of thought that went from Jane Austen and objectivity and history and how the bias of the observer affects historical interpretations and how that affects our historical interpretation of events and how those events, those interpretations are changing thanks to embracing diversity and more diverse voices being heard, and how that then plays itself out in book prizes. I'm not even sure that made sense. And like I said, I'm not sure it's all that profound. That's just been what I was thinking about. Love to see your comments in the comment section below, and as always, thank you for watching.